Hello fellow humans and welcome back to the channel. So one of the biggest questions that a lot of people who want to switch to Linux have is that what distro should I be using? Well, in this video I'm going to talk about different Linux distributions, desktop environments and the differences between them. So let's begin. Alright, so first let's talk about what a distribution actually is. A Linux distribution, or a distro for short, is basically an operating system which bundles together the Linux kernel, a few apps, a package manager, desktop environment and much more. But most people think that the changes between different distributions is the way they look, that is their UI appearance and stuff like that. But that actually depends on what desktop environment the distro is using. For example, two completely different distros might look exactly the same if they use the same desktop environment, even though they might be completely different underneath. We'll get back to desktop environments later. Most Linux distributions are based on three main distributions, that is Debian, Arch and Red Hat. Debian is a very stable and reliable distribution, but it tends to lag behind in updates. Arch, on the other hand, is what we call a bleeding edge distribution or a rolling release distribution. This means that it receives a lot more updates and more frequently and is way more up to date than Debian. But this also tends to make it unstable sometimes, and it is also easier to brick your OS completely if you don't know what you're doing in Arch. So Arch is not usually recommended for beginners. Red Hat, on the other hand, sits in a comfortable middle ground between Debian and Arch, where it is more up to date than Debian, but it's also not quite bleeding edge where you get a lot of updates that it might make your system unstable. Most of the other distributions of Linux are derivatives of the above mentioned distributions. For example, Ubuntu is a very popular distro which is based on Debian, and a lot of people starting with Linux start out with Ubuntu. I would not recommend Ubuntu, I will come back to that later on, but there are also a lot of other Ubuntu based distributions like Elementary OS, Pop OS, Linux Mint and much more. On the Arch based side, we have distros like Manjaro OS, Endeavour OS and Arco OS. And Fedora is basically one of the biggest and only popular Red Hat based distribution. Alright, so now that we know what a distro is, let's talk about desktop environments. A desktop environment, or DE for short, is basically the user interface of the operating system that you interact with. So the look and feel of a distro, or how it looks, is basically due to the desktop environment it's running. A lot of people compare different distros based on how they look, but you can actually make any one Linux distro look like any other just by installing its desktop environment and then customizing it a little bit. There are many desktop environments like, for example, GNOME, which is used by Ubuntu and Pop OS, KDE, which is used by Kubuntu and Feren OS, Cinnamon, which is like a Windows-like desktop environment which is used by Linux Mint, and then there are distros like Manjaro and Fedora which have a plethora of versions featuring different desktop environments, so you can download the version of the operating system with the desktop environment that you like. Alright, so next up, let's talk about another part of a distro, and that is called the package manager. A package manager is basically the program that manages your packages. A package manager is basically a piece of software that allows you to install new apps in your system, update the installed apps, and also allows you to remove apps. There are mainly three package managers that everyone uses: the APT or apt package manager in Debian based distros, Pacman in Arch based distros, and RPM in Red Hat based distributions. Alright, so if you're new to Linux, I would suggest that you don't need to worry too much about learning a package manager right now, because you technically don't need to learn how to use a package manager to install and uninstall apps, as most distributions nowadays have a graphical software store which you can use to install and update apps. But hey, I do recommend that you learn how to install apps through the package managers as well, as it is a quicker and easier way to do it. Oh, and by the way, if you are in Ubuntu, I would highly suggest that you learn how to install through the package manager, or at least look up on Google how to install another different software store for Ubuntu, because the default Ubuntu Snap Store is a piece of garbage. This is one of the many reasons that I don't recommend Ubuntu for people new to Linux, because it's just a pain in the... Alright, so now that I've told you guys about a few main parts of a Linux distro, let us answer the big question that everyone has on their minds. what distro should you use? And that is, honestly, there is no definitive answer. I was obsessed over this question a few months ago when I was switching to Linux, but now I have realized that distributions simply don't matter, because at the end of the day, there is no one perfect distro for everyone that everyone can use. I mean, then Linux would be as bad as Windows or macOS. Each person makes a Linux distro into their own by adding onto it their personal preferences over time, like their personal customizations on their desktop environment and stuff like that. So that's what makes Linux amazing, because unlike Windows or macOS, it does not dictate how you should use it. It gives you, that is the user, complete freedom on how you want to use your operating system. But I do know that there are millions of options, and this answer makes choosing a distribution to start out even more difficult. So let me try to narrow it down a little bit and give you a few options that could act as your gateway into the Linux world, and could make your initial experience with using a Linux distribution as your main daily driver a little bit easier. Now, a lot of people suggest Ubuntu. I am actually not putting it on my list. I believe there are much better Ubuntu based distributions that improve on a lot of Ubuntu's flaws, that you should consider those before going for Ubuntu. If you're coming from Windows and want a safe, stable option, Linux Mint or Zorin OS are your best bets. The UI is quite similar to Windows on both these distros. It has a start menu and taskbar, so you can feel more at home. Distributions like Pop OS and Elementary are personally my recommendations for anyone starting out with Linux, but they do differ a little bit in UI from Windows. I have to warn you about that. I would still suggest to try these ones because the UI is simple enough to figure out and use. But if you're coming over from Mac, then Elementary is actually one of the best choices because its UI is very similar to the Mac OS UI. It has a top panel and has a dock in the bottom, similar to Mac OS. There is no universal menu bar, but other than that, it's almost similar to the Mac OS UI. Manjaro is also a really good option for a first Linux distribution. It is an Arch based distribution, so it is a sort of bleeding edge distribution, gets a lot of software updates and stuff like that. But it is not as unstable as Arch, so it is much better than Arch for beginners. It also has a really nice graphical software store, which is called PAMAC, that I really like. So yes, if you're looking for more a Windows-like user interface, I would suggest you go for Manjaro KDE. But it is also offered in a variety of other flavors containing different desktop environments. So you can choose whichever one you like the user interface, the look of more, and you can go with that. Alright, so that's it for this video, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, hit like, get subscribed, all that good stuff. If you are new to Linux and enjoy such content, comment below and I'll make more such videos about switching to Linux, beginners coming to Linux, what you need to know and stuff like that. Also, if you have any questions about any of the topics in this video, you can join our Telegram group. Yes, we have a Telegram group now. So you can post any questions or share your cool tech projects and stuff, or I don't know, share some funny tech memes, I guess. So yeah, you can do all that. Link to the Telegram group is in the description. So other than that, until next time, live long and prosper.